doing business in Africa. You can't afford to be without Africa Investor.
Would you have been quite vocal about the need to transform the private capital mobilization capacity of multilateral development banks and the development finance institutions and the international financial institutions? Second, what are the priority changes required that you'd like to see in solving the key challenges in delivering on these required changes?
Well, thank you very much, James. Always a pleasure to be with you, and thank you, Excellencies, for the opportunity to hear some views from the African institutional investment community. I think I'm going to start with a plea, which is probably the same thing I'm going to end with. And that is really, I think it's been mentioned earlier on as well, that we really need leadership. But then we've sort of confuted the word leadership with political. And I think what we really are saying as the institutional investment community at this moment, at this time, is that we need climate investment statesmanship. And we're asking for climate investment statesmanship on the market failure relating to private capital mobilization. We really want to be able to work with heads of state as champions to collaborate with us in a very determined way on institutional investment public partnerships. So I'm going to make 4 very quick points, and I'm going to race through this in the interest of time. The first point I'd just like to highlight is that I think we need to be very, very careful. You know, we see this current climate transformation and climate transition agenda as one of a long-term investment agenda, not a short to medium-term green finance MDB agenda. And we say that because we are very concerned that, you know, we run this immediate risk of creating a green finance debt crisis. And we need to get to scale, and the largest pools of capital for that scale are institutional private capital. In fact, our pools of capital from pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, endowments, foundations, insurance businesses is effectively 900 times larger than the multilateral development pool. So we're talking about $150 to $200 trillion in Africa and globally, compared to a multilateral development bank balance sheet, which is collectively, all of them together, about $1.5 trillion. The reason I'm mentioning this is not to show how big our pool is, but just to show where emphasis needs to be placed if we're trying to accomplish scale. And it seems that we're spending about 90% of our private capital mobilization focus as government on working with the MDBs. And it's even been sort of enumerated in many places that even if we get the reforms through, they will only be able to solve about 10% of the private capital mobilization and the investment gap. And we're actually spending less than 10% with institutional investors that have the balance sheet to close 90% of the investment gap. So we just think it's really important to really focus on building that relationship with the institutional investment community so we can align around delivering scale. Second point really just again emphasizes the point on private capital mobilization. And the elephant always in the room is that there is some measure of these reforms can be implemented quite easily and quickly on private capital mobilization from the MDBs. Why isn't it happening? I think if you ask many private sector financing institutions, you will hear the sense that there is some degree of competitiveness. Now that might just be points of view, but then when you begin to look at the private capital mobilization ratios, you might start becoming a bit of a conspiracy theorist. Private capital mobilization, as determined by and reported on by the G20, suggests that for every $1 of multilateral development bank finance that's provided, it's supposed to mobilize $10, at least $10 of private capital. The actual results for MDBs in terms of delivering this private capital mobilization ratio is instead of delivering $10 for every $1, they've only been accomplishing 20 cents to 38 cents for every $1. And then if you go further in this time when we're all very stretched and balance sheets are very under pressure, the G20 also points out that if the MDBs only accomplished half of their ratio, in other words, for every $1 that they provide, they actually mobilize $5 of private finance. And that's, again, lowering the bar. But if they just got to 5 instead of 20 to 38 cents, that would increase the private capital mobilization funding available by $7 trillion US dollars. And in addition to that, it would increase their balance sheet capacity by $800 billion. So I think we actually need to create more institutions that can actually deliver private capital mobilization at scale. Institutions like the African Green Infrastructure Investment Bank, for example. Third point, and I think it's been mentioned by our colleagues from the US, private capital mobilization, again, is dependent on insights. We need data. And the MDBs control probably the best risk assessment database for emerging markets. It's known as the GEMS database, the Global Emerging Markets Database. We've been asking for about 10 years to be able to get access to this data so that we can properly price risk for emerging markets and essentially increase our allocations. That has continually been denied, and the fact is, because this database has not been democratized by multilateral development banks, emerging markets and African governments are paying an extra $15.6 billion each year in excess interest payments on loans. So we think we absolutely need to do something about this urgently and immediately. It's a no-cost reform. They must just democratize that database. We as the investment community, trying to be a little bit proactive, have established a platform called GEMS 3.0, where we are waiting to get the GEMS database key data from the MDBs, and then we will add some of our own data. So we don't just get access to the data, but we can then enhance it with some of our own data, and then it can become much more of an asset allocation tool. Project pipeline, which is my last point here, is very important for us to look at. In the climate world, for us, it's very important to know that governments are really backing climate projects, so we know the difference between a real climate project and perhaps a bit of a greenwashed climate project. And the best and most effective way for us to establish that is if a project is a nationally determined contribution project. And we know that we've got about $3 trillion worth of nationally determined contribution projects that we need to effect by 2030 and the next decade after that. The challenge that we are having, and this is where we come back to MDBs and private capital mobilization, is that it's becoming apparent that the nationally determined contribution projects are being designed with technical assistance from multilateral development banks, and as a consequence they're being designed so that they can align more with the provision of development finance as opposed to ultimately creating a project that the private sector can invest in. And when it comes to Africa and emerging markets, unlike other markets around the world, particularly G7 markets, the majority of our NDCs will need to be invested in by the private sector. We do not have fiscal capacity within a lot of our governments after coming through so many crises in succession. So we need to have a very different culture, a very different posture in crowding in and working with the private sector. So we really hope that that message can get through. So, Chair, just to close out, I think what we're really calling for is an investment earthshot. President Ruto so eloquently described our trajectory for green industrialization being one where we move from a current 9 billion investment or extraction and raw material export proposition up the value chain to the 40 billion and then potentially go for the 7 trillion. I believe we can get to that 7 trillion if we have a much smarter, more strategic and pragmatic investment earthshot mentality and approach, and that we can partner to really get to that 7 trillion, but we need to do it through institutional investor public partnerships. So let's seize this moment, leaders, friends, colleagues, we all need to work together, and let's do it with a full scale ahead mentality. Thank you.
Doing business in Africa, you can't afford to be without Africa Investor.